what we're going to do today is learn how we use reflection to build a conceptual framework about anything that we're reading. So if I'm in a chapter, it doesn't matter what it's on. Let's say it was psychological disorders in a psychology textbook. So I'm reading that, but before I begin to read, it is extremely important that I get a large conceptual framework. Now, a conceptual framework is a bunch of information that is interrelated and will become prior knowledge, so that everything that you learn past learning this conceptual framework, you learn easier, and it transfers to problem solving and all that kind of stuff. So, Paul, remember we talked about cats last time? What do you know about cats? Everything you know about cats is your conceptual framework, so that if I taught you something new about cats, you would have that conceptual framework, so the brain just goes and it connects it much easier, and you learn much faster, and you're able to use the information easier. Well, a conceptual framework for psychological disorders, there's things you need to know, and since everything tends to be introduction to psychology, sociology, biology, or what have you, generally you don't come with a conceptual framework, and in the first page or page and a half, they usually help you develop one. But here's the deal. If you read the first page and page and a half and continue reading without reflecting, you will not remember much of anything unless you already knew it. Within 3 minutes, it will all start to go. And what you do learn goes to this part of the brain. This is a picture of Paul that we took earlier. This is the amygdala. If the information goes to the amygdala, I can get to it, but I can't think with it, and it doesn't serve as a framework for learning new information. What I want it to do is go to this prefrontal cortex here. The prefrontal cortex is the executive part of the brain that allows for problem solving, thinking, reasoning, planning, all the things you do. They're called higher order thinking. And what we know is that if you learn in a way that it goes here instead of here, then you can't do what's called transfer learning. You can't use the information in new situations. So reflection that we're going to focus on today is all about how do I reflect while reading that moves information here instead of here. Everybody got it? I mean, that's just kind of what we're talking about today. So turn to page 141 in your textbook. And I'll do the same. Everybody got it? Anybody not have a textbook? Look over her textbook. You got a textbook? Will you share? Okay. Everybody on 141? As you see, we are going to talk about psychological disorders. And as you can see from this book, you're going to have a little introduction. They're going to tell you about somebody that's got a psychological disorder so that you start getting a sense of where we're headed. So you always read that and think about what you already know about it. So when you read that, stop and reflect. What do I know? Do I know other people who have these kinds of things? How is this related to other things I know? I got somebody smiling in here that says, I know a bunch of people with psychological disorders. All right. Now we're going to get down to the nitty-gritty of what we do. Now remember, everything that we're going to learn is how the brain learns naturally. So what we're going to do with reflection is really very simple. What we're going to do when we reflect is have the information come in through the brain cell, create new dendrites, and then strengthen the myelin sheath, which means that the speed in transmission is quicker, so I can get to the information the way I can think with it, and it transfers. But it does something else. It moves it to this part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, which makes a huge difference. So I'm going to begin modeling. I am going to read this and tell you what's going on in my brain, that is the strategies and what reflection is. Reflection is nothing more as I am reading, do I stop and think about my thinking? And the kinds of questions that you do, these are called cognitive strategies. The very basic question is, what do I already know about whatever it's saying? What do I know about it? And then, do I actually understand what it's saying? Probably want to ask if you understand it first. If you don't, you probably need to reread it and think about it. So here we go. See where it says number 1? Defining and explaining psychological disorders. I'm going to start reading here. I'm going to start looking at the heading. Defining and explaining abnormal behavior. So, what do I already know about abnormal behavior? Well, I know occasionally I have a student in class who doesn't seem to know how to behave in a way that a student would behave. Is that abnormal behavior? And is it a psychological disorder? Now, what I am saying when I'm talking about I had a student, or it could be I was in my family or any place else, it doesn't make any difference. I am going back, I am stopping and thinking about my thinking, what do I already know about it, so that I tap these dendrites of prior knowledge. It's called priming. I am sending electrical signals down this neural pathway so that myelin sheath wraps around more and insulates more, so that when I get ready to learn about abnormal behavior and psychological disorders, the brain is ready, bam, to get on with it, for whatever it is I happen to know. If you have a question, just raise your hand. Okay, now I'm going to start to read what it says, and as I do, I am going to reflect, which means I'm going to simply step back in my mind, think about my thinking, like, do I understand this? What do I already know? There's lots of other questions that you can ask. How's this like or different from something else? There's a bunch of things. But we're just going to stick with the basics just to get the sense of reflection. Because once again, if you don't reflect while you are reading, you may understand everything perfectly, but it doesn't move from the amygdala into the prefrontal cortex, and then the value to you is reduced tremendously. So I'm going to begin reading. What makes behavior abnormal? I'm going to step back in my head and reflect. Well, abnormal behavior, I guess it's when people don't act like everybody else acts, we'll call it abnormal. And I don't have to be right. In effect, what I am doing is I am predicting what they're going to talk about, what this is about. And when I predict, it doesn't matter whether I'm right or wrong. I am going in and tapping prior knowledge so that I can make connections later. And if I am wrong, when I go in, begin to read, and it's not what I thought it was, it tends to, when it sees dendrites or related information that's different than what I thought it was going to be, it pays more attention. What happens when it pays more attention? It gives more time, and it sends more signals down through here as I'm trying to solve the problem in my mind. It wraps that myelin sheath, and whatever I am learning actually gets stronger. So learn to predict. Just guess what's going to happen. That's what you want to do with this. I continue reading. The American Psychiatric Association defines abnormal behavior in medical terms. Okay, it's in medical terms. The language will be medical. I'm reflecting. If you want to know, I'm not okay. A mental illness that affects or is manifested in the person's brain and can affect the way the individual thinks, behaves, and interacts with others. So, when I read this, I want you to look up right now. Do not look back down at your paper. Turn to your neighbor and tell them what were the 3 things that it said, this mental illness, that it affects. Can you say what the 3 things are? You just read it. What I want you to know, even though you understood what you were reading, the 3 things, the odds are 1 or 2 of them are going to go immediately, and within the next minute, you couldn't tell me what the three things were at all. Except if you already had prior, you see what I'm saying? Forgetting occurs very rapidly unless you do something with it. At this point, because it has defined abnormal behavior, you want to stop and reflect. You want to re-expose yourself to the information which wraps that myelin sheath, which makes this strong, so anytime in the future that you're dealing with anything related to it, you can get to it easier. Because if you don't do that, you don't get to it easier. Now turn to your neighbor and tell them what the three things were. All right. Because we're trying to get it up here so I can think with it later. Now, young lady, you're going to be my psychiatrist in the class today.
Okay.
You're an expert in the field. You know about psychological disorders, okay?
Okay.
So later in the class, as we're discussing this, we're going to send someone to you that thinks they might have a psychological, or someone has sent them to you because they think, the husband, the wife, the parent, or whoever, they think this person may have a psychological disorder. You have to have learned the information well enough that it's up here so you don't have to think with it, it's automatic. So you've been triggering all of this. You'd be surprised how many people get their degrees, learn all their stuff here, and then when they go to practicums, or actually have to get out and work with whatever they're doing, they know the information, but they can't apply it. Anybody in nursing, allied health, what have you? 20% of your questions will be application questions. It's all about, can you take the information and use it? And a lot of people who are very good at memorizing become very shocked when they start to understand, they don't really know the information. Now, the point, we have read that abnormal behavior is a mental illness. Something's happening in the brain, that's what we mean by, that's going to cause or have an effect on thinking, behavior, social interaction. Very good. What I want you to notice, how many of you have done mind mapping or webbing or that kind of thing? You may or may not have. You may recognize it when I do it up here. But if the brain organizes information, it builds these neural networks of interrelated information so that it's much easier if you get to one piece of information to get to the other pieces of information. And it's absolutely crucial that information is organized if you want to be able to use it. So here's a little visual tool that we use. We'll talk about it more later. Behavior, abnormal behavior. And you can think psychological disorders at this point. So what was the first one?
Thinking.
I'm just going to put SI for social interaction to save time. But these are the three things. And if you do a visual graphic and then learn the information around that